Welcome, Professor Rita Felski. You're head of a program, Use of Literature, here at the university, and you're going to be head of a conference, Love, etc., which is going to be held in October.
Mhm.
Uh, but could you say more about love? Because, love is in the movies from Hollywood, love is in the pop songs on
Mhm.
Spotify, or in the magazines or the books you can buy in the supermarket. What can you tell more about love from a research point of view?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I think there's a bit of a paradox in the way academics have thought about love, because as you say, on the one hand, love is everywhere in Hollywood movies, in music, in magazines, and that's just to talk about romantic love, and of course, as well as that, there's also, love of parents or love of children, love of one's pets, love of animals, love of one's country, love of the environment, obviously becoming incredibly important, so love drives so many different aspects of human activity. And yet, I think love has been neglected a little bit in academia. It's not been obviously completely ignored, but I think there's been a tendency to emphasize perhaps the more negative phenomena in the world. There's been a strong emphasis on conflict, there's been a strong emphasis on inequality. And in terms of emotions, there's been an emphasis perhaps to a much greater extent on attitudes such as boredom or anxiety or alienation rather than happiness and rather than notions of love, say. And then when love has been talked about, there's often been an assumption that it needs to be treated with a certain skepticism or suspicion, that love is the veil for rather more insidious things going on, that it needs to be questioned, that it needs to be treated as something that's not entirely trustworthy, that we need to go beyond it to find what's really going on. So in that sense, we're trying, in this conference to take love seriously in its own terms, which is actually not so very common. And while love, as you say, is an extremely old, perhaps one of the oldest emotions, I think there's actually still a lot to be said about it. We've hardly scratched the surface. Right, well, the etc. is actually a crucial part of the conference, I think, because one of the things we want to do in this conference is also explore alternatives to the word love, right?
Yes.
Synonyms for love. And the reasons for that, again, I think are twofold. So on the one hand, one problem with the word love is that it's one small word that's being used to cover a bunch of different things, right?
Yes.
As you may well know, for example, the ancient Greeks had several different words for love to distinguish, say, between erotic love and sexual love on the one hand, love of a friend, love of the divine. These are quite different things.
Yeah.
And we just have this one word to cover all the, first of all, very different feelings, which can be very intense and passionate, or can be quite low key and, everyday-ish. And then also the forms of love that have quite different objects. You can be in love with an idea, you can be in love with a person, and so on. So one idea is to kind of explore options, alternative options to this language of love, because it's limited in a certain way. Then there's a second aspect, which is kind of another obvious point, really, which is that the language of love is pretty much a cliche, right?
Yeah.
And we've all heard the word love thousands and thousands of times. It's in every romantic song. You can go to the supermarket and in the greeting card section, you'll find all these kind of cliched, poems about love or whatever it might be. And that's also, I think, another big problem we need to wrestle with. A couple of decades ago, there was a famous quote by the Italian philosopher and novelist Umberto Eco, who was trying to describe postmodernism. And he said, what describes the postmodern attitude? And the answer was, well, the postmodern attitude is a man who's in love with an educated, cultured woman. And he wants to say to her, I love you madly. But he knows, and he knows that she knows, that this phrase has been used in countless romance novels, right?
Yeah.
So how does he solve this dilemma? Well, Eco says, well, the only thing he can do is to say, as Barbara Cartland would say, the famous romance novelist, I love you madly. And he says, but by acknowledging the prior existence of this phrase, he acknowledges his own lost innocence, right? That we can no longer use the word in an innocent or naive way. Now, I'm not sure I want to follow Umberto Eco's, suggestion here, but the idea is that we really want to explore alternative words for love, whether it's passion or obsession or infatuation or even liking, actually. One of the talks is going to be about trying to rescue liking as a more kind of philosophically serious term than it's often taken to be, which, especially in the age of Facebook likes, I think is quite a timely idea.
Yes. As keynote speakers, you have chosen Nawali Isabel, She's from Zambia, and she's also a scholar from United States, and she has just released her new novel, her first novel called
Right.
The Old Drift, which has received very good reviews. And you also invited Hannah Ørstavik. She's very popular in Denmark,
Okay.
and she's also very well known in Scandinavia for her novels. How it come that you have chosen writers, as keynote speakers in a conference about literature? Could you elaborate a little
Sure,
bit on that?
sure. Well, as you say, it's been wonderful to see Namali Sapel get these amazing reviews for her new
Yes,
novel, which has been reviewed in pretty much every venue in the English-speaking world, in England
yes,
and the United States and so on, and got an extraordinary review from Salman Rushdie in the New York Times Book Review.
yes.
So that's been actually marvelous, but in a sense, it's been like a bonus or a kind of icing on the cake because we sent out the invitations for this conference well over a year ago. And at that time, I didn't know that Namali had this forthcoming novel.
Okay.
So I'd actually chosen to invite her on her merits as a literary critic. The idea was to have one keynote on criticism and one keynote by a novelist. And I didn't know she was about to become a novelist herself. And as a critic, she's written on areas that interest me too very much. She's interested in like aesthetic experience, how we feel when we read novels, the kind of textures of our emotions and our thoughts and how they interact. And she's going to be giving a fascinating presentation, I think, on the question of loving and hating American Psycho. You may
Yes.
remember American Psycho
Yeah.
was this sort of classic, Bret Easton Ellis,
yes.
that's right, the classic novel of the 1980s, of course, made into a film later about Wall Street greed.
Yeah.
And I think she's going to be exploring both her own responses and responses more broadly in terms of their ambivalence. And I think that's a very interesting topic because, again, thinking about the meanings of love, I think certainly in relation to our works, and probably even more in relation to people, love often goes along with negative feelings of hostility or certainly at least dislike. So I'm very eager to hear what she has to say about this mixture of love and hatred in her own reader response. I think that's going to be extremely interesting.
And what about Hannah Ørstavik?
Yeah, so then in Ørstavik, so, I thought it was very important that we have a Scandinavian writer at this conference. And so a colleague of mine recommended Ørstavik, and I read her book called Love. And I was just blown away by it. I thought it was just an extraordinary novel. It's been translated into English.
Yes.
It's both formally very interesting in the way that it moves quite seamlessly from the perspective of the mother to her young son in ways that's often quite hard to tell who's thinking or speaking, so you really have to be paying attention. And it also gives a very kind of bleak and I suppose rather pessimistic or even tragic view of love, in terms of the lack of connection between this mother and her son and his fate at the end, which I won't explain in case someone hasn't read the book. But I just read this novel and I thought it was marvelous and I was very excited to invite her. And I think she's going to be talking at the conference about how the idea of love or the experience of love has shaped her writing as a whole.
Yeah. But you have, the papers is about Tinder and the Bachelors, TV programs as the Bachelors, and on the other hand, you have literature, politics, and things like that. Why did you choose such a broad perspective and approach at the conference?
Well, I think, on the one hand, as you say, it's a very broad conference. We're dealing with literature, we're dealing with love from lots of different aspects, politics, philosophy, popular culture, and so on. Robot love is another talk that I'm extremely interested to hear. It sounds like a wonderful topic for a lecture. But at the same time as we have this breadth, we also really decided to organize the conference around two key focal points. So they're going to be very important. So the first central idea we're addressing is the idea of love of literature. In other words, what does it mean to be strongly attached to a particular novel or a particular poem, to become obsessed with a particular author so that you might go and visit, the home where they grew up, for example, or to read into the night, even though you have to get up early for work the next morning because you can't give up a particular work of literature. So we want to kind of explore that in all its many dimensions, right, and try and work out what it means. But then we also want to think about love in literature. In other words, love as a theme in literature. How is love represented? And obviously that's changed a lot, especially in recent decades, with the rise of feminism, with increasing emphasis on gay and queer issues and trans issues. And so the whole notion of what constitutes love is really being reimagined, in very interesting ways.
And that is the connection to uses of literature, which is the title of the whole program.
Right, exactly. So, as you said at the beginning, I'm involved with a large research group at the University of Southern Denmark called Uses of Literature. There's around, I don't know, exactly 25 of us, and we all work together. It's been a wonderful experience for me. We're an international group, and we're also very much an interdisciplinary group.
Yeah.
So we have, historians, and we try and use sociology, and we bring media studies into the mix and so on. So what we're trying to do in this research group is come up with new ways of thinking about literature, right? On the one hand, we don't want the idea of literature some kind of separate, sacred thing off by itself, cut off from the world, just loving literary language for its own sake. But we're also not entirely satisfied. We're not entirely satisfied with some of the political approaches to literature we've had in the recent decades, where literature has been understood only as a kind of example or as a symptom of some larger political system. It's defined in terms of capitalism, or it's defined in terms of sexism, or whatever it might be. And here we feel, again, the distinctiveness of literary works get lost. So we're trying to come up with these new ways of thinking about literature, thinking about novels and poems, and indeed also films, as social actors that move through the world, that hook up to a lot of different things, whether it's audiences or publishers or reviews or other works. Of course, adaptation's a huge thing now, right? That novels become movies, become video games. So we're trying to think about literature in this kind of broad network of social relations, while also thinking seriously about what literature does as literature.
Yeah. You used the word hooked before, and you have also told me that your next book is going to have the title Hooked. So could you tell me a little bit about your research and how the conference relates to your own research and perhaps your book?
Yeah, sure. So, about the last 10 years, I've been especially interested in coming up with alternatives to what's sometimes called a hermeneutics of suspicion, which simply means the idea that you interpret works, if you're an academic, that is, in a kind of suspicious and critical and detached way. You see them as being guilty of something, of obscuring patriarchy or being complicit with capitalism, or whatever it might be. I mean, that's been kind of a fairly popular way of approaching literary works. And I'm certainly not against those kinds of approaches. I've written several works of scholarship that deal with feminist issues, where I looked at how, for example, views of gender and views of women in literary works can be problematic. But I do think that, this kind of approach is not sufficient. And lots of questions are getting lost that we really need to be asking, especially now when literary studies is being overshadowed by, the sciences and technology and so on. We need to emphasize much more why literature matters, why people care about it, why it's important to them, why they love it, if you like. So that's something I've been thinking about in a couple of books that I published, over the last 10 years. And then I have this new book, as you say, called Hooked, Art and Attachment, which really tries to make a case for attachment as a key word in the humanities, right? I mean, we're all attached, but we tend to think, at least academics tend to think of attachment as something of a problem. We need to free ourselves from our attachments. And this book is really saying attachment is a good thing. And let's think more about its complexities and how it works. It deals, the book deals with literature, but also with painting and music and film. And there's a lovely essay by the British novelist Zadie Smith at the centre, which I think is a fascinating essay, where Zadie Smith talks about the fact that, well into her 30s, she hated Joni Mitchell.
Yes.
And she hated Joni Mitchell because she just couldn't make any sense of her music. She said it was this white girl's warbling, it was discordant, it was shrill, it was not the kind of music that appealed to her. Her friends pushed Joni Mitchell upon her, but she just couldn't get it. And then suddenly, almost overnight, she has this conversion experience. And now she says she cannot listen to Joni Mitchell without crying because she finds the music so beautiful. So it's these kinds of stories that interested me. So, I'm looking in this book, the reasons we become attached to artworks. And some of those reasons may be psychological, your own individual temperament.
Yes.
Some of them are sociological, obviously things like your gender or your class or racial background or your age shape the kinds of books you like. But there are also kinds of attachments that are much less predictable, right? Where you can't really explain why you get hooked by this one piece of music and not by another one. And so I try to look at those too and work out what exactly is going on.
Thank you very much, Rita Felski. We're looking very much to the conference.
Thank you.